Studio executives called it the stupidest idea ever pitched. Critics predicted it would destroy careers. The lead actor was so embarrassed by it that he tried to erase it from his history and refused to speak about it for decades. Even the director thought it was beneath him. Everyone involved believed they were making trash that would be forgotten in weeks. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. That worthless B-movie became a cultural phenomenon that terrified an entire generation and made more money than anyone could have imagined. The Blob wasn't just controversial because of what it showed on screen. It was controversial because it broke every rule Hollywood believed in. It proved that you didn't need expensive effects, famous actors, or studio approval to create something that would haunt millions of nightmares. It was made by outsiders, filmed in small towns that big studios mocked, and created with materials you could buy at a hardware store. The monster itself? Colored silicone and vegetable dye? Basically glorified kitchen gelatin, and it worked better than movies that cost 100 times more. The establishment hated that. They hated that this cheap little film exposed how unnecessary their expensive systems were. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about the Blob. Number 20. The star was almost rejected for being too old. Steve McQueen was the hero of the Blob, but he almost didn't get the part. Why? Because he was already 28 years old when they filmed it. Think about that for a second. 28. The character he played was supposed to be a teenager in high school. The producers looked at McQueen and saw a grown man with lines on his face and a receding hairline. They didn't see a young kid cruising around town with his girlfriend. They saw someone who looked like he should be paying taxes and worrying about mortgages. But McQueen needed the work desperately. He was a struggling actor who had done small television roles, but nothing big. He wanted this chance badly, so he auditioned anyway, and somehow he convinced them he could pull it off. The director, Irvin Yeworth, saw something special in McQueen. He saw intensity, he saw star quality. He saw someone who could make people believe in anything, even playing a teenager when he clearly wasn't one. So they gave him the role, and McQueen did something smart. He didn't try to act young, he didn't put on a fake high-pitched voice or start skipping around like a kid. He just played it straight and cool, the way only Steve McQueen could. He wore simple clothes, drove the car with confidence, and spoke with that natural tough guy charm he had. When audiences watched the movie, most of them didn't even notice his age. They were too busy watching him fight a giant blob. They saw his bravery, his quick thinking, his determination to save his town. Sure, if you looked closely, you could tell he wasn't 17. But in the dark theater, with the Blob oozing across the screen, nobody cared. McQueen made it work through pure charisma. And here's the twist. This too-old actor became one of the biggest movie stars in the world just a few years later. The Blob was his first leading role, and it launched everything that came after. What almost ended before it started became the beginning of a legend. Number 19. The monster was stored in a supermarket freezer. After every day of filming, the crew faced a strange problem. What do you do with a giant blob made of silicone when you're done shooting? You can't just leave it sitting around. The material they used would eventually break down in warm temperatures. It would start to separate and get runny. All that careful coloring would get uneven. The blob that looked so perfect and terrifying on camera would turn into a useless puddle by morning. They needed to keep it cool and preserved somehow. But this was a low-budget movie. They didn't have fancy storage facilities or temperature-controlled rooms. They barely had enough money to make the movie at all. So someone came up with a crazy solution. They asked the local supermarket if they could store the blob in their big commercial freezer overnight. And somehow, the supermarket agreed. Can you imagine that? You're shopping for milk and bread, and right behind those big freezer doors, past the ice cream and frozen vegetables, there's a movie monster taking up space. Every night after filming, the crew carefully packed up the blob, loaded it into a truck, drove it to the supermarket, and tucked it into the freezer alongside frozen peas and TV dinners. Every morning, they reversed the whole process. They picked up their defrosted monster and brought it back to the set. The supermarket employees must have thought it was hilarious. Or maybe it freaked them out. Imagine working the early shift and opening that freezer to see a massive red gelatinous thing sitting there, frozen solid. Did they poke it? Did they tell their friends? Did customers ever find out? The movie crew kept this arrangement going for weeks. It became part of their daily routine, just another weird detail in making an unusual film. And it worked perfectly. The Blob stayed preserved and ready to terrorize audiences, all thanks to a small-town grocery store with a big freezer and a sense of humor. A Hollywood monster slept between the frozen chicken and the ice cream every single night. Number 18. The movie was filmed in a real small town that embraced it. The Blob wasn't filmed in Hollywood or in some big studio lot. It was shot in Downingtown and Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, real small towns with real people living real lives. The director wanted authentic locations, the kind of classic American Main Street that you'd see in any town across the country. He wanted viewers to think, this could happen where I live. So instead of building sets, they just used what was already there. They filmed inside actual stores, on actual streets, with actual buildings. And the townspeople didn't just allow it. They got excited about it. When the crew arrived to start filming, locals came out to watch. Kids rode their bikes to the locations. Shop owners let the filmmakers use their businesses. The local movie theater, the Colonial Theater in Phoenixville, became one of the most famous scenes in the film. That's where the Blob attacks during a midnight screening and panicked teenagers come running out the front doors screaming. Those extras running and screaming? Many of them were actual residents of Phoenixville. Regular people who had never been in a movie before suddenly became part of horror history. They showed up, took direction, and ran out of that theater like their lives depended on it. The scene looked so real because the fear on their faces felt genuine. They were having the time of their lives, pretending to escape from a monster in their own neighborhood theater. After filming wrapped, the town didn't forget about it. The Colonial Theater kept showing the Blob year after year. It became a local tradition. Decades later, Phoenixville started hosting an annual Blobfest celebration where fans gather to watch the movie and recreate the famous running out of the theater scene. Hundreds of people participate every year, pouring out of those same doors, screaming and laughing. A one-time movie shoot became a permanent part of the town's identity. What started as a few weeks of filming turned into a legacy that still lives today. Number 17. The Blob's movement required impossible camera tricks. Making the Blob move convincingly was one of the biggest challenges the crew faced. Remember, this was 1958. There were no computers, no digital effects, no motion control cameras. Everything had to be done practically, right there on set, with real materials and real physics. The Blob was essentially colored silicone, and silicone doesn't move on its own. It just sits there. It doesn't ooze. It doesn't creep forward menacingly. It doesn't consume victims. It's completely passive. So how did they make it look alive? The answer was turning cameras upside down and filming everything backward. Here's how it worked. They would set up a scene, maybe the Blob squeezing through a small opening or flowing down a street. Instead of trying to push the silicone forward, which looked fake and lumpy, they would flip the camera completely upside down. Then they would pull the silicone backward using wires and sticks, carefully controlling how it moved. When they played the film in reverse and flipped it right side up again, the Blob appeared to move forward on its own, creeping and oozing with an eerie, unstoppable quality. Gravity helped too, by positioning things at angles and letting the silicone naturally settle and spread. They created movement that looked organic and frightening. But this technique caused constant headaches. Every shot had to be meticulously planned. They had to think backward about everything. If the blob needed to move from left to right on screen, they filmed it moving right to left. If it needed to climb upward, they filmed it falling down. Actors had to perform their reactions in reverse, too, which felt completely unnatural. They had to pretend to back away from something that was actually being pulled away from them. One small mistake meant reshooting the entire sequence. Sometimes they spent hours setting up a shot that lasted only seconds on screen. The camera operators got dizzy working upside down. The crew developed whole new techniques just for this one movie. What looked smooth and terrifying in theaters was total chaos behind the scenes. Number 16. Steve McQueen hated the movie and refused to talk about it. After The Blob came out, Steve McQueen became famous. Not instantly, but gradually over the next few years, his career took off. He landed bigger roles, better scripts, more prestigious directors. He became the king of cool, the actor everyone wanted to work with. He drove motorcycles, raced cars, and played tough guys who didn't take orders from anyone. He became a symbol of American masculinity and rebellion. And through all of that success, he absolutely hated talking about The Blob. He despised it. In interviews, when reporters brought it up, he would brush it off or change the subject. He called it embarrassing. He said it was a silly monster movie that he only did because he needed the money. To McQueen, The Blob represented everything he wanted to leave behind. It reminded him of struggling, of taking whatever work came along, of being desperate. He wanted people to remember him for The Great Escape, Bullet, The Thomas Crown Affair, not for fighting a giant pile of jelly in a low-budget horror film. His friends said he genuinely felt ashamed of it. When the movie came on television, he wouldn't watch. If someone mentioned it at a party, he'd walk away. He saw it as a stain on his reputation, something that undermined his credibility as a serious actor. But here's the ironic part. The Blob is the movie that gave him his first leading role. It's the movie that proved he could carry a film, that audiences would pay to see him. Without The Blob, there might not have been a Steve McQueen superstar. Casting directors saw him in it and thought, this guy has something special. It opened doors that had been closed before, and even though McQueen refused to acknowledge it, fans loved The Blob. They didn't think it was embarrassing. They thought it was fun, scary, and memorable. They watched it at drive-ins and late-night TV screenings for decades. Today, it's considered a classic of 1950s science fiction horror. McQueen spent years running from the role that launched him. What he saw as his worst moment became one of his most enduring legacies. Number 15. The famous diner scene, used real animal guts. One of the most disturbing scenes in The Blob happens inside a small diner. The blob seeps in through the vents and starts consuming everyone inside. People scream and try to escape, but the blob is everywhere, covering the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It traps the cook in the kitchen, and you see him pressed against the window as the blob slowly absorbs him. His face twists in terror, his hands push against the glass, and then he's gone, dissolved into the red gelatinous mass. For 1958, this scene was shockingly graphic. Audiences weren't used to seeing people consumed on screen like that. It created genuine nightmares. To make the blob look even more disgusting and realistic, the special effects team did something revolting. They mixed real animal organs into the silicone. They got cow intestines, pig stomach linings, chicken parts, whatever the local butcher would give them. They chopped these pieces up and stirred them into the blob material so that when it oozed and moved, you could see dark shapes and textures inside. It wasn't just smooth-colored gel anymore. It had depth and dimension. It looked like something that had already eaten living things, because in a way, it had. The organic matter created shadows and lumps that made the blob seem more alive and more horrible. The smell on set was apparently unbearable. Imagine animal guts sitting under hot film lights for hours. The actors had to perform their terrified reactions while fighting not to gag from the stench. The crew complained constantly. They opened every window and door, but the smell lingered. Some people wore cloths over their noses between takes. But the director insisted it was worth it because the blob looked so much better, so much more real and threatening. When audiences saw that diner scene, they believed the blob could actually consume people. They saw texture and substance that made their stomachs turn. What created that perfect horror came from a butcher shop, not a special effects lab. Number 14. The theme song became a surprise hit single. When you think about classic horror movies, you don't usually think about catchy pop songs. Horror films have scary music, ominous strings, dramatic orchestras that build tension. They don't have upbeat tunes you can sing along with. But The Blob broke that rule completely. The producers hired a songwriter named Burt Bacharach, who would later become one of the most famous composers in the world, to write a theme song. And Bacharach, who was young and still figuring out his style, came up with something totally unexpected. He wrote a bouncy, playful, almost silly song with lyrics that went, "Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door, and all around the wall, a splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob." When the producers first heard it, they weren't sure what to think. It was catchy, definitely, but it didn't sound scary at all. It sounded like something you'd hear at a sock hop or a high school dance. But they decided to use it anyway, playing it over the opening credits. And something strange happened. People loved it. Audiences walked out of theaters humming the Blob song. Radio stations started playing it. It became a genuine hit single, climbing the music charts. Kids sang it at school. Parents heard it on the radio and recognized it from the movie. The song took on a life completely separate from the film. What made it work was the contrast. The song was light and fun, but the movie was dark and terrifying. That combination stuck in people's minds. They couldn't forget it. The cheerful melody made the horror somehow more unsettling because it created cognitive dissonance. Your brain heard happy music but saw scary images, and that mismatch created a unique kind of unease. Burt Bacharach went on to write dozens of classic songs and win multiple awards, but the Blob theme was his first success. He later said he never expected a monster movie song to launch his career. A silly tune about a gelatinous alien became a cultural phenomenon. Number 13. The Air Force provided real equipment for the final scene. The ending of The Blob involves the military, specifically the Air Force, coming to help the small town. The Blob has grown enormous, consuming dozens of people, and nothing seems to stop it. Guns don't work. Fire makes it bigger. Conventional weapons are useless. Then someone discovers that cold freezes it, stops it from moving. So they call in the Air Force to transport the frozen blob to the Arctic, where it can never thaw. In the final scene, you see real military transport planes, real equipment, real soldiers working to load the blob onto the aircraft. And all of that was genuine. The production somehow convinced the United States Air Force to participate in the film. This was during the Cold War, when the military was very careful about its public image. They didn't usually help with low-budget horror movies about space monsters. But something about the Blob appealed to them. Maybe it was the idea of the military saving the day, being the heroes who solve the problem when civilians can't. Maybe they saw it as good publicity, showing American military strength and readiness. Whatever the reason, they agreed to provide real planes, real personnel, and real cooperation. The filmmakers couldn't believe their luck. Suddenly, their tiny independent movie had actual Air Force transport planes in it. Soldiers in uniform appeared as extras, following real military protocols. The equipment was authentic down to the smallest details. This gave the ending a legitimacy and scale that would have been impossible otherwise. The film went from looking like a cheap B-movie to something that felt official and important. When audiences saw those big military planes, they believed the Blob was a serious national threat. They believed the government would actually respond this way. And the Air Force got what they wanted too. They looked competent, organized, and heroic. It was a win-win situation that almost never happens in filmmaking. A monster made of colored silicone got transported in real military aircraft. Number 12. The Blob almost destroyed an actual building. During one of the most dramatic scenes in the movie, the Blob attacks a grocery store and oozes through every opening, terrifying the people trapped inside. To film this sequence, the crew used an actual grocery store in town, not a Hollywood set. They had permission from the owner, who thought it would be exciting publicity. What could go wrong? Well, quite a lot, actually. The special effects team needed to make the Blob appear to break through windows, squeeze under doors, and flood into the store interior. To create these effects, they used much more silicone material than usual, gallons and gallons of the stuff, mixed with dyes and additives to make it flow better. They positioned cameras, set up lights, rehearsed the scene, and then released the Blob. Immediately, things went sideways. The silicone flowed faster and thicker than they expected. It spread across the floor in every direction, not just where they wanted it to go. It seeped into cracks and crevices in the real floor. It stained the actual walls. It covered real shelves and real products. The stuff was everywhere, far more than they could control. And worse, it started seeping into areas they couldn't see, like underneath the floorboards and into the building's foundation. The crew panicked. They tried to stop the flow, to scoop it up, to contain it somehow. But silicone is slippery and spreads quickly, especially when there's a lot of it. They managed to film the scene they needed, but the cleanup was a nightmare. It took days to remove all the material. Some of it had permanently stained the wood. Some had dried in places they couldn't reach. The store owner was furious. What was supposed to be a fun collaboration turned into property damage. The production had to pay for repairs and restoration, costs they hadn't budgeted for. The crew learned a hard lesson about working with practical effects in real locations. What looked amazing on camera almost destroyed someone's livelihood. Number 11. Actors worked in dangerously cold conditions for ice scenes. Remember how the Blob gets defeated by freezing? That became a major plot point, and they needed to film scenes showing the frozen Blob, solid and immobile. To make this look realistic, they decided to actually freeze the Blob material and film it in genuinely cold conditions. But this created serious problems for the actors. They were wearing light clothing, typical for teenagers in summer, because that's what their characters would wear. The movie takes place during warm weather at drive-ins and diners, not in winter. But now they had to stand around in freezing temperatures, pretending everything was normal while ice and frozen props surrounded them. The filming location was cooled down as much as possible. They brought in industrial air conditioners and ice machines. They needed the Blob to stay frozen solid during filming, which meant keeping everything below freezing temperature. The actors stood in this environment for hours, doing take after take, shivering violently between shots. Their teeth chattered so hard they had to do dialogue multiple times to get clean audio. Their breath created visible clouds, which the cinematographer had to work around because summer nights don't show breath vapor. Some actors developed mild frostbite on their fingers and toes. Others got sick with colds and flu that delayed production. Steve McQueen later complained that it was the most physically uncomfortable filming he'd ever done. He wore a thin jacket and regular shoes while standing on frozen ground under artificial ice. He said his feet went numb after 20 minutes, but they kept filming for hours. The crew wrapped the actors in heavy blankets between takes and gave them hot drinks constantly. But the moment the camera rolled, they had to strip off the warm layers and pretend to be comfortable. Medical staff stood by to watch for signs of hypothermia. It was legitimately dangerous. But when you watch those final scenes, you never think about any of that. You just see brave teenagers fighting to save their town from a monster. The cold looks like determination on their faces. What actually was suffering looked like heroism on screen. Number 10. The original Blob was lost for decades after filming wrapped and the movie was released. The Blob itself, the actual silicone prop used in the film, was stored away. In those days, movie props weren't considered valuable. They were just tools used to make a film, like hammers and nails. Nobody thought about preserving them for history. So the Blob went into storage somewhere, probably a warehouse or basement, and people forgot about it. Years passed. The movie became a cult classic. New generations discovered it on television. It played at midnight screenings and drive-ins throughout the 60s and 70s. People quoted lines from it. They remembered the scenes, but nobody knew where the actual Blob was. Collectors and film historians started looking for it in the 1980s when movie memorabilia became valuable. They contacted the original production company, the director, anyone connected to the film. But nobody had answers. Some people thought it had been thrown away. Others believed it had decomposed since silicone doesn't last forever. There were rumors it had been sold privately, or that it was sitting in someone's garage, forgotten and unrecognized. The mystery became part of the movie's legend. Where was the Blob? Then, decades after the film's release, someone found it. A piece of the original Blob turned up in the possession of a prop collector who bought it at an estate sale without knowing what it was. He recognized it only because he was a huge fan of the film and noticed the unusual material and color. Authentication experts verified it as genuine, one of the actual pieces used during filming. It had survived all those years, dried and hardened, but still recognizably the Blob. The discovery made headlines in collector communities. The piece eventually went on display at a movie museum where fans could see it in person. Finding it felt like recovering a piece of film history that everyone thought was gone forever. An icon that terrified millions had been lost in a basement somewhere. Now it sits behind glass, a preserved reminder of practical effects and 1950s ingenuity. Number 9. The director was a religious filmmaker who saw moral messages. Irvin Yeaworth, the director of The Blob, wasn't a typical horror filmmaker. He didn't come from Hollywood. He didn't have a background in monster movies or science fiction. He was actually a religious filmmaker who made Christian educational films and documentaries. He ran a production company that created content for churches and religious organizations. So when he was offered the chance to direct a horror movie about a giant alien blob, it seemed like a complete mismatch. But Yeaworth saw something deeper in the story. He saw moral and spiritual themes that interested him. To Yeaworth, the Blob represented sin or corruption, something that starts small but grows and consumes everything if left unchecked. The teenagers in the film are dismissed and ignored by adults, but they're the ones who recognize the danger first. They're the ones who take action. To him, this represented young people having moral clarity that their elders had lost. The adults in the film are skeptical, dismissive, too set in their ways to see the truth. They waste time while the problem grows. Only when they finally listen to the youth can they solve the crisis together. Yeaworth saw this as a parable about faith, about listening to truth no matter where it comes from, about acting decisively against evil. He brought this perspective to the production. He treated the film seriously, not as throwaway entertainment, but as storytelling with purpose. He worked with actors on their motivations, asking them to think about what their characters believed and valued. He framed shots to emphasize isolation and community, darkness and light. Other directors might have just focused on making the Blob look scary and getting through scenes quickly. Yeaworth thought about meaning. This approach gave the film an unexpected depth. Audiences felt there was something substantial beneath the surface, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. After the Blob became successful, Yeaworth went right back to making religious films. He never pursued a Hollywood career. He saw the Blob movie as one project among many, all aimed at communicating ideas he cared about. A religious filmmaker made one of horror's most enduring monsters. Number 8. The opening meteor scene. Used a real meteorite fragment. The Blob begins with an old man discovering a meteor that has crashed in the woods near his property. He pokes it with a stick and it cracks open, releasing the Blob, which immediately attaches to his hand and starts consuming him. This meteor is crucial because it explains where the Blob came from: outer space. For this important prop, the filmmakers could have used foam, plaster, painted rocks, anything fake that looked right on camera. But they decided to do something unusual. They used an actual meteorite fragment. One of the production team members was an amateur astronomy enthusiast who collected meteorites as a hobby. He had several pieces in his personal collection, real fragments that had fallen from space and been recovered. He offered to loan one to the production for filming. The director loved this idea. Using a real meteorite added authenticity, he thought, even though audiences would never know the difference. It felt right to have something genuinely from space representing an alien threat. So they took this person's meteorite, a chunk of space rock that had traveled millions of miles and survived entry into Earth's atmosphere, and they made it a movie prop. They positioned it in the woods, lit it dramatically, and had the actor approach it with wonder and fear. The meteorite performed its role perfectly, looking ancient and otherworldly under the film lights. After filming that scene, they returned it carefully to the collector, who probably had the best story in his astronomy club. See this meteorite? It was in a movie. The funny part is that actual meteorites are incredibly rare and valuable. What they used as a simple prop would be worth thousands of dollars today. They were essentially throwing money on the ground and having actors poke it with sticks. But in 1958, nobody thought about it that way. It was just a cool rock that happened to come from space. A genuine piece of the cosmos introduced a fictional monster to Earth. Number 7. The Blob inspired real scientific research. After the Blob became popular, something unexpected happened. Scientists started using it as a reference point when discussing certain biological phenomena. Specifically, researchers studying slime molds, single-celled organisms that can merge together to form larger masses, would mention the Blob when explaining their work to general audiences. Slime molds behave in ways that seem almost intelligent. They can navigate mazes, find food efficiently, and even display something like memory, all without having a brain. When individual slime mold cells come together, they create a larger organism that moves and behaves differently than the individual parts. Sound familiar? In the decades after the movie, when scientists discovered more about how these organisms work, they realized the Blob wasn't as fictional as everyone thought. There really are things in nature that act like it, consuming nutrients, growing larger, moving with apparent purpose, and being difficult to stop. Of course, real slime molds don't eat people, and they're microscopic rather than house-sized, but the basic concept isn't pure fantasy. This gave the film an unexpected scientific credibility. Researchers giving lectures would show clips from the Blob to illustrate how slime molds move and behave. Students in biology classes would watch the movie and then examine real slime molds under microscopes, drawing comparisons. The film became an educational tool, something its makers never intended. Science documentaries about unusual organisms would reference it. Papers about collective behavior and emergence used it as a pop culture touchstone that made complex concepts accessible. The Blob went from being just a movie monster to being a metaphor in actual science. Researchers studying everything from cell behavior to swarm intelligence to cancer growth patterns found the imagery useful. A 1950s horror film accidentally predicted and illustrated real biological processes that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. Fiction inspired scientific communication and maybe even inspired some scientists to study these phenomena in the first place. A monster made of silicone helped people understand the real natural world. Number 6. The movie was almost called The Molten Meteor. Before they settled on The Blob, the filmmakers went through dozens of potential titles. They knew the name was crucial. It had to be catchy, memorable, and convey the threat somehow. Early in development, the working title was The Molten Meteor, which emphasized the space origin of the creature. It sounded science fiction and dramatic. Marketing people thought it would look good on posters, but test audiences didn't respond to it. Molten suggested heat and lava, which wasn't accurate to the story. The Blob wasn't hot, it was actually cold sensitive. And meteor made people think of rocks and impact craters, not a living, consuming organism. So they kept brainstorming. Someone suggested the mass. Too vague? The glob? Too silly. The creeping unknown. Already used by another film. They tried combining words, making up words, using scientific terminology. Nothing clicked. Then someone in a meeting, frustrated and joking around, called it the blob in a dismissive way, like, we can't even figure out what to call the blob thing. And suddenly everyone stopped. That was it. The Blob. Simple, unusual, slightly funny, but also slightly gross. A blob is shapeless, undefined, something that spreads and makes a mess. It was perfect. Not everyone agreed at first. Some executives thought it sounded too childish, too silly for a horror film. They worried people would think it was a comedy or a kids' movie. But the director insisted. He knew that blob was a word that would stick in people's minds. You could say it easily, you could remember it, kids would repeat it. And there was something unsettling about the word, too, something visceral and unpleasant. It made you think of something formless and disgusting. They went with The Blob, and it turned out to be a brilliant choice. The title became iconic. Everyone knows what you mean when you say The Blob. It's recognizable worldwide. Other movies have tried to copy the simple one-word title approach, but few have succeeded like this one did. What almost got called something forgettable became one of the most memorable movie titles ever. One casual comment in a frustrated meeting changed film history. Number 5. Local teenagers were paid almost nothing to be extras. The film needed lots of young people to fill out crowd scenes, especially the famous sequence where teenagers run screaming from the movie theater. In Hollywood, extras would be paid union rates, provided with transportation and meals, treated according to strict labor regulations. But this production was happening in small-town Pennsylvania with a minimal budget. They couldn't afford professional extras. So they recruited local teenagers, kids who lived right there in Downingtown and Phoenixville, promising them the chance to be in a real movie. Dozens of young people showed up, excited and eager. They thought it would be glamorous and fun. And it was fun mostly, but it definitely wasn't glamorous. They were paid almost nothing, maybe $5 or $10 each, just enough to cover their time. Some were paid in food, getting free meals from craft services. Others did it entirely for free, just for the experience. They spent long hours standing around while the crew set up shots. They did take after take after take of the same actions. Running out the theater doors, screaming convincingly, looking terrified, then doing it all again from a different angle. The director pushed them to give genuine reactions. Really scream, he'd say. Act like you're about to die. These kids, who had never acted before, threw themselves into it. They screamed until their throats hurt. They ran until they were exhausted. Between takes, they laughed and joked around, having the time of their lives. This was the most exciting thing that had ever happened in their small town. Years later, many of them said being in the Blob was one of their favorite memories, something they told their own children and grandchildren about. But at the time, they had no idea the movie would become a classic. They just thought it was a fun weekend activity that paid pocket change. They didn't receive residuals when the film made money. They didn't get royalties when it played on television for decades. They were just kids who ran out of a theater one summer and accidentally became part of film history. What felt like a lark became their claim to fame forever. Number 4. The Blob's color changed throughout production. If you pay close attention while watching The Blob, you might notice that the creature doesn't always look exactly the same color. Sometimes it appears bright red. Other times it's more purple or dark maroon. Sometimes it's almost pink. This wasn't artistic choice or lighting effects. It was an accident caused by practical problems. The Blob was made from batches of silicone that had to be mixed fresh regularly. The material would break down, get contaminated, or get used up during filming. So the crew constantly made new batches. Each time they mixed a new batch, they had to add red dye to color it. But getting the exact same shade every single time was nearly impossible. They didn't have precise color matching technology. They just eyeballed it, adding drops of dye until it looked about right. Sometimes they added too much and the Blob came out too dark. Sometimes not enough and it was too pale. Different dye bottles from different suppliers had slightly different tones. The lighting on set affected how the color appeared on film. Film stock itself could shift colors depending on how it was processed. The filmmakers worried about this inconsistency. Would audiences notice? Would it break the illusion? But when they screened early cuts of the film, nobody seemed to care. People were too scared, too caught up in the story to analyze the exact shade of red from scene to scene. The Blob's color variation actually made it seem more organic and alive somehow, less like a static prop, and more like a living organism that might change appearance as it grows and consumes. What they feared was a mistake turned into an accidental benefit. In later years, when the film was restored and remastered for home video, color correction experts could have evened out the Blob's appearance, made it consistent throughout. But they chose not to, preserving the original look with all its variations. Those inconsistencies are now part of the film's authentic character, part of what makes it feel handmade and real. What they couldn't control perfectly became something they wouldn't change. Number 3. Steve McQueen did his own dangerous stunts. Steve McQueen was already known for being tough and physical, someone who did things himself rather than relying on stunt doubles. Even early in his career making The Blob, he insisted on doing his own action scenes. The film required him to run from the Blob, climb through tight spaces, handle fire extinguishers that could malfunction, and perform physically demanding sequences. The production couldn't afford experienced stunt coordinators or safety equipment. They just had to be careful and hope nothing went wrong. In one scene, McQueen's character uses a fire extinguisher to fight the Blob, spraying CO2 at it while backing away. Fire extinguishers can be dangerous. The pressure is extreme, the metal canister can explode if damaged, and the CO2 itself is freezing cold and can cause frostbite. McQueen handled the real thing himself, not a prop. He aimed it, triggered it, felt the kickback and the blast of freezing gas. Between takes, his hands were numb from the cold. The crew worried he might get injured, but McQueen waved them off. He wanted it to look real, and the only way to achieve that was to actually do it. Another scene required him to climb on rooftops and navigate narrow ledges while appearing to flee the Blob. This was filmed on location, on actual buildings, with real height and real danger. No safety harnesses, no crash pads below. Just McQueen carefully making his way across genuine rooftops while cameras filmed. One slip could have meant a serious fall. The director kept telling him they could use a double for the wide shots, but McQueen refused. He believed audiences could tell the difference between an actor and a stunt person, even from a distance. He wanted every frame to be authentically him. This commitment to realism came with costs. McQueen finished filming with bruises, scrapes, and sore muscles. But his physical performance gave the movie an intensity it wouldn't have had otherwise. When you watch him fight the Blob, you're watching real effort, real exertion, real risk. What could have been faked was genuinely dangerous. Number 2. The film's success launched an entire genre. Before The Blob, science fiction horror movies existed, but they usually followed certain formulas. Alien invaders arrived in flying saucers. Monsters were created by atomic radiation. Threats came from recognizable sources with clear explanations. The Blob did something different. It presented a threat that was formless, mindless, and unstoppable. It wasn't a creature you could reason with or a machine you could break. It was just mass, consuming everything, growing larger. This was terrifying in a new way. The film's success proved that audiences wanted this kind of horror. They didn't need complicated explanations or sympathetic monsters. They responded to pure, simple, relentless threat. After The Blob became a hit, studios started making similar movies. Films about unstoppable forces, spreading threats, things that grew and consumed. Movies about killer plants, expanding organisms, infectious substances that turned people into mindless spreaders. The whole subgenre of spreading horror really took off after The Blob showed it could work. Beyond specific imitators, the film influenced how filmmakers thought about monsters. It proved you didn't need an expensive costume or elaborate makeup. A simple, practical effect, well executed and properly lit, could be just as frightening as any detailed creature. This opened doors for lower-budget filmmakers who had great ideas but limited resources. If The Blob could terrify audiences with colored silicone, maybe you could make effective horror with whatever materials you could afford. The film democratized monster making in a way. Film scholars later recognized The Blob as a turning point in horror cinema, the moment when formless existential threats became viable antagonists. It influenced everything from body horror to zombie films to modern contagion thrillers. Directors like John Carpenter, David Cronenberg, and George Romero grew up watching The Blob and absorbed its lessons about simplicity, atmosphere, and unstoppable dread. A low-budget movie from Pennsylvania changed what horror could be. Number 1. The Blob represented real 1950s. Fears. The Blob wasn't just a random monster, it was a perfect symbol of what terrified America in the late 1950s. This was the height of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons existed that could destroy entire cities. The Soviet Union seemed like an unstoppable threat spreading across the globe. Americans built bomb shelters and practiced duck and cover drills in schools. Fear was everywhere, shapeless and growing. And here came the Blob, a creature from space that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons, that grew larger with every victim it consumed, that threatened to cover everything. People at the time consciously or unconsciously understood what the Blob represented. It was communism, spreading and consuming. It was nuclear fallout, invisible and deadly. It was the anxiety of modern life, the feeling that things were out of control and getting worse. The Blob had no face, no personality, no motivation. You couldn't negotiate with it or understand it. You could only try to survive it. That formless dread matched exactly how people felt about the threats they faced in real life. The teenagers in the film were significant too. In the 50s, there was massive generational tension. Young people were questioning authority, creating new culture through rock and roll and rebellious fashion. Adults saw them as problems, as threats to traditional values. The Blob reversed this dynamic. The teenagers were the heroes who recognized danger first, who took action while adults dismissed them. The film validated young people, suggesting they might see truths that their elders missed. For teenage audiences, this was empowering. For adult audiences, it was either uncomfortable or a call to listen more carefully. Even the ending, freezing the Blob and sending it to the Arctic, reflected real strategies of containment that America pursued in foreign policy. You couldn't destroy the threat, but you could contain it, isolate it, keep it away from where it could do harm. This was exactly how America approached the Cold War, building alliances and barriers to contain Soviet influence, The movie's solution mirrored real political strategy. The Blob worked on two levels. On the surface, it was fun monster entertainment, a scary movie to watch at the drive-in. But underneath, it processed real cultural anxiety, giving form to formless fears. That's why it resonated so deeply and lasted so long. It wasn't just about a space monster. It was about what it felt like to be alive in that specific moment in history, facing threats you couldn't fully understand or control. A 1950s horror film captured its era perfectly. Every generation that has watched it since has found their own fears reflected in that spreading red mass. Bonus fact: The Blob was almost remade in the 70s with a massive budget. Most people know that The Blob was eventually remade in 1988 with modern special effects and a bigger budget. But few know that there was almost a remake in the 1970s that would have been even more ambitious. A major Hollywood studio acquired the rights and wanted to create a blockbuster version with top directors and huge special effects. This was during the era when disaster films were massive hits, movies like The Towering Inferno and Earthquake that featured all-star casts and spectacular destruction. The studio envisioned The Blob as that kind of spectacle. They commissioned scripts from multiple writers. Some versions expanded the Blob's origin story, explaining exactly where it came from and why. Others turned it into a global threat, with multiple blobs appearing in different cities worldwide. One script featured the Blob growing so large it threatened to cover an entire state. The studio talked to major directors and offered huge budgets for effects. They imagined using advanced techniques that had never been tried before, creating a blob that would be truly realistic and terrifying. Casting directors approached A-list actors trying to get major stars attached to the project, but the remake never happened. Why? Because the studio couldn't solve a fundamental problem. How do you make a formless blob visually interesting for 2 hours with 70s technology? Computer graphics didn't exist yet. Stop-motion animation would look cheesy. Practical effects could only go so far. Every solution they explored either looked fake or cost too much money. The larger they made the blob, the less realistic it appeared. Test footage looked ridiculous. Models looked like toys. The project stalled and eventually was abandoned. Looking back, it was probably for the best. The original film's simplicity was its strength. A massive big-budget version might have lost the intimacy and authentic fear that made the original work. Sometimes bigger isn't better. Sometimes a small-town story with limited resources captures truth that spectacle cannot. The remake that almost happened might have been forgotten quickly, while the humble original still plays to audiences decades later. One small choice, deciding not to force something that wasn't working, preserved the original's legacy. The Blob is more than just a movie about a monster from space. It's a reminder that great stories don't need massive budgets or famous actors or complicated effects. They need imagination, dedication, and the willingness to try something different. A small group of people in Pennsylvania made something that would outlive them all, using little more than colored silicone and creativity. They faced problems every single day, from frozen actors to runaway props to impossible technical challenges. But they kept going, kept trying, kept believing they were making something special. And they were right. The fears that the Blob represented in 1958 aren't gone. Every generation faces threats that feel formless, unstoppable, beyond control. The Blob still works as a metaphor because that anxiety is universal. But the film also reminds us that ordinary people, even those dismissed by authority, can face those threats with courage and intelligence. The teenagers in the movie save their town not through special powers, but through persistence, observation, and working together. That's a message that never gets old. Steve McQueen went on to become a legend, but he started here, fighting a gelatinous monster in a small town. The silicone blob that terrified millions was stored in a grocery store freezer. The theme song that became a hit was written as an experiment. Every weird fact, every strange choice, every accident and improvisation came together to create something memorable. That's the magic of filmmaking. That's why we keep watching these stories. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time. The Blob taught us that small things can grow into something huge, that simple ideas can become immortal, and that what looks like chaos behind the camera can become art on the screen. Keep watching, keep wondering, and keep discovering the secrets hidden in every frame.